Hello everyone. In this video I'm going to be talking about the role that psychedelics can play in the process of healing trauma or healing PTSD. And I wanted to start this video off by saying that I'm not advocating that everyone should go out and do psychedelics. It's been my observation that some people just can't handle it, and it's not anything that you should feel bad about or anything like that. It's just that these are very chaotic, and it can be very confusing experiences for people. And it's been my consistent observation that from the time a person actually has their their first significant experience with psychedelics, it's usually about a year that they've spent either in therapy or maybe not even necessarily that, but more doing what I call psychological growth and transformation. So a lot of mindfulness, a lot of ego development, a lot of shadow integration, and really learning about their minds and learning about themselves. And I was a couple years into my journey, and I had a friend of mine who was experiencing a medical condition, and we thought, after doing a little research, that it was possible that psilocybin might help resolve it. And so I encouraged him to try taking like 1 gram or 2 grams and see. And I told him, do it at home, send the kids to the your parents' house or whatever, and just set and setting and all that. And I was, back then I really felt like even if he didn't get if it didn't help with his medical condition, he would still get something out of it, because I had had so many positive and transformative experiences with psilocybin that I was really passionate about sharing it with other people, in the sense of like encouraging other people to have the experience. And unfortunately, after he tried it, he reported back that I believe his comment was, "I didn't realize my mind was such a scary place." And it was because he wasn't ready for it. He wasn't ready to have that experience yet. And so do I think everyone should experience psychedelics at some point in their life? Yeah, probably. But whether or not you're at that point yet, that's something really only like you can figure out. And there is also the question of, should you be doing psychedelics alone, or should you do it with a sitter or a therapist or whatever? And that's also a question that you have to figure out on your own. And so I just wanted to kind of start this video by saying I'm not advocating that everybody should do psychedelics. They are powerful, and they're powerful. And what that means is they can help or they can hurt. And there are some people that have experiences with psilocybin or other psychedelics, and it basically breaks their conception of reality, and it almost shatters their psyche. And it can take time for that person to put themselves back together, if they ever do. And I'll also tell 2 stories. A friend of mine, a friend of a friend actually, stabbed himself over 24 times in the chest while he was high on psilocybin. And another time I was driving through Rocky Mountain National Park in Colorado, and there was a guy probably in his 20s, late 20s maybe, walking down the side of the road, and he had his arms outstretched and his face up to the sun and a big smile on his face, and he was just walking down the side of the road. The problem was his pants and his underwear were around his ankles, and there were dozens and dozens of cars full of families driving by. And so that guy's probably now a registered sex offender. And if I had to guess, I would say he was probably on psilocybin, although it might have been LSD or something else. I don't really know. I just saw him as I drove past. So these drugs are powerful, and you need to use them wisely. And so without further ado, let's jump into it. I'm going to be talking about 2 different drugs or medicines in this video. MDMA, which as far as I can tell is an experience unto itself. There's no other psychedelic that really offers a similar experience. Now, MDMA is a synthetic, which means there are other synthetic compounds that are similar to MDMA that probably have similar effects, but I'm not familiar with them, and I don't really know anything about them, and so I'm not really going to talk about them. And so I'm going to just say that MDMA is kind of a drug unto itself. It's its own kind of experience. The other drug I'm going to be talking about in this video is psilocybin, and the mechanisms for what psilocybin facilitates in terms of healing. My sense of it is that LSD and DMT also offer similar types of experiences, facilitate similar types of healing. And so I'm not going to talk about LSD or DMT or ayahuasca. Ayahuasca is DMT, but in this video, but I think my sense of it is that they're going to be very similar to the way that psilocybin works. And so without further ado, let's jump into it. So MDMA, what does it feel like? Well, I'm not going to get into like super detailed description, but it's basically you're shifted into a very, very positive state of being. And in this state of being, you're very loving, you're very trusting, you're very compassionate, you're completely fearless, you feel very connected with people, with reality, and you're just kind of full of love. And it's a very, very positive experience. And what that allows people to do, because you're seeing things from a completely different perspective, right? Is it really aids with healing in some very, very like extremely profound ways. And so I've talked in other videos, I talk about the 3PA model that I created, right? The 3 problem area model, and the 3 core problems of PTSD as I think of them. And the first problem area is disrupted physiology, and that includes having a dysregulated central nervous system, what I call overactive physiology, so having a fight or flight response that's being triggered too frequently or too easily. And then the other problem in that problem area is alexithymia, or internal/emotional numbness, the inability to feel sensations and emotions in your body. And with this first problem area, MDMA can help, because from this very safe, compassionate, loving perspective, you can kind of look at the patterns in your life and look at see how you've been looking at the world, and realize how much fear you've been living in, and realize the way that fear has affected your behavioral patterns. And I think from this perspective, it's going to be a lot easier for people to recognize all the ways in which they're kind of keeping that overactive central nervous system, that overactive physiology going. Because in the video I made about how to heal an overactive central nervous system, I talk about how one of the things that you have to do is create a new normal. And what I mean by that is you have to pay attention to when your body is being triggered and bring it back down to baseline. And you also have to pay attention to how you're using your attention, right? Are you constantly scanning for threats? Do you have some paranoid behavior that you're acting out that's keeping that's signaling to your nervous system that it needs to be in that heightened state? There was periods where I would get out of bed 3 or 4 nights a week and grab my pistol and clear through the house because I thought someone was breaking in. And that was, quite frankly, that was paranoid behavior. I didn't live in a dangerous neighborhood. No one was ever trying to break in. And I'm almost like embarrassed to admit this, but for some of that period, I had a German Shepherd. There was no reason I needed to go through that, 3 or 4 nights a week. And because I was keeping myself in that heightened state of alertness, it was kind of maintaining that overactive physiology. And so I think MDMA can really help a person recognize the ways in which they're living in fear, and the behavioral and thought patterns that are maintaining that overactive physiology. And then when it comes to emotional numbness, I really think MDMA is extremely powerful in opening up those emotional pathways. I also think that it can really help people, especially people that were traumatized as a child, that have never really experienced some of those positive emotions. Maybe like I really didn't know, I had alexithymia and I had internal numbness, and so I didn't know what some of those positive states of being felt like. And so it's almost like if you think of it as an analogy, like temperature, right? It's almost like you've been living in a cold forest your whole life. And so you only know cold and cool. And then now all of a sudden you find yourself in a hot tub and you're like, whoa, holy shit. Like there's this whole other range of the spectrum that's a lot more pleasant and a lot more positive. And not only that, but from those positive states of emotion, from those positive states of being, you see the world differently. You think about the world differently. And so my sense is MDMA can be very useful for healing that first problem area. And I normally don't talk about things in terms of the brain, because I really believe that the problems in the brain are manifested by problems of the mind. Mind comes first. And I really think that the focus of researchers on treating PTSD as some kind of a brain problem, almost as if it's like a mechanical problem, something's went wrong with the brain, is what's held them back from figuring out more and making more progress and figuring out how to heal and how to treat PTSD. And so I don't normally talk about PTSD in terms of the brain, because it just doesn't make sense to me. That's not how I conceptualize the problem. However, with MDMA, my sense of it is that it does seem to do something where it changes some shifts the chemical balance, or does something, does something in the brain where it almost like kind of shifts it, where it's easier for you to be in a more relaxed state of being, a more positive state of being, in order for you to feel safe. And so I really believe MDMA can help with that first problem area. Now, the second problem area is what I call monuments of misery, and that's my term basically for unprocessed traumatic memories, but it's a little more complicated than that. But basically unprocessed traumatic memories. And I have a video where I talk about 4 ways to process traumatic memories. And the first way is emotional purging, so letting yourself feel and express the emotions and dissipate them and get rid of that emotional charge that you've been carrying around. And my sense of it is MDMA really doesn't help with that, because you're in such a positive state of being that you can't feel those negative emotions. You can't express those negative emotions. Now, I do think, though, what it can really help with is somebody that is at the point where they need to start being vulnerable with themselves themselves so that they can acknowledge all the ways that they've been, all the pain and suffering that they've been carrying around, all the anger, the resentment, and all of that, and the way maybe that's been affecting them. And from this positive state, they can be vulnerable with themselves, they can be kind and compassionate with themselves, and they can acknowledge that they have been carrying around a lot of pain. And so that can open up the potential, I think, for some people in some cases, where then afterwards they can do that emotional purging. But I don't think, my sense is MDMA doesn't really help directly with that emotional purging. Now, the second way to process trauma is shadow integration. And again, I don't really think that, or I'm sorry, the second way is pattern recognition. So understanding like the underlying why the whys, why the person did that, kind of everything that was involved in the event, and coming to understand it at a more deeper level and processing through that. And I think MDMA can really, this is one of the things that it does really well, because from this very compassionate and kind perspective, it's easier to be reasonable in the way that you assess things. So you imagine somebody that has like survivor's guilt, let's say, right? And from this place of, on MDMA, from this place of like pure compassion and pure kindness and connection, they can have that for themselves too. And they can see the way that it wasn't their fault and that they've been basically torturing themselves this whole time. And so it can really help a person kind of make sense of some of the patterns involved in their trauma and help them process it. Now, the third way I talk about is shadow integration, and I don't really think MDMA helps too much with that, because my sense of it is that shadow integration requires you to understand evil through your own shadow. And so it's almost like you have to enter into like native states of emotion in order to understand your shadow, because that's where it's going to make more sense. Now, I do think on MDMA, because you're in this kind and compassionate state, you can see how other people behave the way that they did because of all the pain and suffering and rage that they had, right? And so, it's like in that video I talk about like the Columbine shooters, right? If you go and read their diaries, it's just rage and resentment all the way through. And so from this place of compassion and kindness, you can see how that person was hurting and how that pain led them maybe to commit the acts that they did. And so I think it can help with, but again, that kind of goes back to the making sense of patterns, right? So it kind of helps with shadow integration, but not so much. And then the last way to process traumatic memories I talk about is time and narrative, and that's kind of fitting the event into your life story, right? Realizing that it's in your past, putting it in your past, keeping it in your past, and realizing that you have this whole life ahead of you that you can live. And I think that MDMA, again, this is where it really shines and where it can really help people with kind of sorting through and making sense of their life story and fitting their trauma into that narrative in a way that allows them to then move forward into a better future. And my first experience with MDMA was not too long after I went through my divorce and my mom died. And that first dose really allowed me to kind of process through all that and really put all that behind me. And I'm not necessarily saying those things were traumatic necessarily. I'm not saying that they were necessarily a source of my PTSD, but they were things that I had to process and work through before I could go and deal with some of the deeper problems that I had. And then that was kind of a pattern that played itself out in future experiences with MDMA, where I was able to kind of sort through what had happened to me and kind of put it in perspective. And so I think MDMA can be really powerful in that regard. And then again, where it really shines is with the third problem area with moral injury, because what we're doing is we need to repair the relationship that we have with ourselves, with people, and with reality, right? And so from this place of pure compassion and pure kindness and pure love and pure connection, it's a lot easier to find that forgiveness for yourself and for other people and for reality even. And I talk about in the moral injury video how the key phrase, as far as I can tell, to healing moral injury is to understand all is to forgive all. And from this place of kindness and compassion, it's a lot easier to gain the understanding necessary to forgive. And so I really think that MDMA can facilitate a lot of healing when it comes to moral injury as well. And again, I mentioned, it allows a person to forgive themselves, to realize that maybe, they've been carrying around feelings of shame and guilt that they don't really need to be. And it's from that place of compassion for themselves, right, in this case, that they're able to make those shifts. And so I really think MDMA is one of the most powerful tools available for healing from trauma. But again, it needs to be used wisely. And then let's talk about psilocybin. That's the one that I have the most experience with. So with the first problem area of having a dysregulated nervous system, having overactive physiology, and alexithymia, I think psilocybin can really help with that, because what psilocybin does is it does a few different things, but one of the big things that it does really well is it just puts you in different perspectives. And I say puts you there because it's like, it's like, boom, you see things from here, and then like, boom, you see things from over here, right? And so it shifts you to these different perspectives. And so it's like, similar to MDMA, how you can recognize the ways in which you've been living in fear, some of the behavioral patterns that maybe don't really make sense from this new perspective, right? And so you can see maybe there's better ways that you could do things in a way that would facilitate a better lived experience for you. And so psilocybin can really help with that. Psilocybin can also help open up those emotional pathways. It can help put you in very positive states of being. Not quite the same way that MDMA does, it's different. But again, it can help. I really think it can help open up those emotional pathways and help a person feel some of those positive emotions that maybe they've been shut off to, right? And then with the second problem area, again, this is where I think psilocybin can really help, because with the emotional purging, psilocybin can like really help with that, and it can actually be almost too intense at times. And actually, people talk about bad trips, right? Well, there's no such thing as a bad trip, but there are hard trips. There are difficult trips. And some people do have bad trips. It's a bad trip if you don't get anything out of it or if you hurt yourself, right? But if you get something out of it, then it's not a bad trip. But I've had a lot of really hard trips, because with that emotional purging, man, it's not even like you open up the floodgates on the dam. It's like all of a sudden the dam's gone, and it's just, you're being just hit with all of that entire reservoir of negative emotion. And that can be overwhelming, and it can be really unpleasant. But I spent a lot of time on psilocybin just kind of screaming and crying into a pillow and just letting out a lot of pain and terror and rage and grief that I'd been carrying around. And so it really helped with I feel like it really helped with that emotional purging. And then with shadow integration, it can definitely help, because it will shift you into perspectives where you really understand why a person did something and how a person would have to think and feel in order to commit those acts. And that can, again, be a very unpleasant experience for people. And that's why, I know people that had experiences with psilocybin, and then they were positive, but then they got to a point where the trip started getting harder and harder, and they just walked away because it was just too much for them to bear. And I don't blame them or fault them for that. It's not a criticism of them in any way. It's just, psilocybin will help you process through your traumas, but some of that work is going to be extremely painful and difficult. And so it's like buyer beware, like you got to be wise in the way that you use these things. And that's why it's smart, especially if you're inexperienced, to have a trip sitter or work with a therapist or something like that. And also why I don't advocate that everyone should just go out and do it. But psilocybin, it kind of manages the trip for you in a way. It's almost as if there's some kind of intelligence or consciousness behind the experience that's kind of guiding you through it. And I don't know whether that's, Terence McKenna would talk about, quote unquote, the mushroom, right? Having its own kind of intelligence. Could also be your unconscious mind. Who knows? Consciousness is a weird and a strange and funny thing, And so, but it can help with the shadow integration, and it can definitely help with the fortitude towards ugliness, because I found myself, not literally, but kind of figuratively, sitting in some really dark places and looking at some very awful things. And it's kind of like, I never felt as terrified when I was in Afghanistan as I did in the nightmares that I had afterwards. Because whatever like layers of mental armor I have when I'm awake and conscious and interacting with the world, they don't exist when I'm in my nightmares, right? And so that's kind of what it's like on psilocybin, only way worse. And so it's like, with the fortitude towards ugliness, it's like there are times where it's almost unbearable, but you learn to stand up in that and to hold your head high and keep your shoulders back and bear it. And I've done a lot of work when it comes to developing fortitude towards ugliness on psilocybin. But again, that's a difficult experience, and it's not for everyone. But my sense of psilocybin can really help with that. And then with the third part of processing traumatic memories, I always get those two mixed up, don't I? Well, anyways, pattern recognition. So it can really help you understand why people did things and the underlying patterns, why you reacted the way you did, and all of that, because like I said, it can shift you to these different perspectives. And so psilocybin, more than anything, it really provides understanding, I'd say. And it provides understanding because it just shifts you and you understand. And that can be a really dark thing. Like, you probably don't want to know exactly how someone that wants to hurt children thinks. That's a pretty awful thing to really understand. And it's a terrible thing to experience, especially when you're on high doses of psychedelics. But it can be very healing, and it can be very cathartic, and it can really help with and help with the healing process and help facilitate healing. And then the fourth way I talk about to process traumatic memories is that time and narrative. And again, I think psilocybin can help put things in perspective for people, help people realize like that was then and this is now, and you have your whole life ahead of you. And so psilocybin, I think, really is powerful in that regard as well. Where I think psilocybin, like really, like this is what it does, man. Like this is the thing, right? Is with moral injury. Because what psilocybin will do is, and in the moral injury video, like I talk about how what we're trying to do is reprogram our core beliefs about the world, right? What psilocybin will do is it'll come in and rearrange your beliefs. And so you see the world all of a sudden in a much more positive way and in a much more healthy way. And I, had experiences where I would, have an experience with psilocybin and I'd be lifted out of my depression. And, I'd go from feeling really shitty and depressed and indifferent and nihilistic, cynical, resentful and all that, and seeing the world as this kind of shitty place and seeing people as shitty and seeing myself as kind of shitty. And psilocybin would kind of just come in and change all that. And all of a sudden, you come out of it seeing the world as a paradise that you're lucky to get to live in. And the problem is that we have those well-worn neural pathways, right? Neurons that fire together, wire together. But I like to think of them as ruts. And so we have to maintain that shift afterwards. And that's why, it's important to realize that psychedelics aren't going to just fix everything for a person. That there's work that they have to do to get the most that they can out of those experiences, right? And so what psilocybin can really help with is that moral injury, because it will help a person conceptualize the world in a different way. And that shift can really help them with healing those three relationships, right? The relationship with self, the relationship with people, and the relationship with reality. And also it can move you to different perspectives. And some of those perspectives are pretty far out there. Like, you start to conceptualize time a lot differently. Like you watch a civilization rise and fall in a matter of minutes, and you start to realize, like, I don't know, it just makes you conceptualize the world in a different way and think about yourself in a different way and your place in the world in a different way. And so, psilocybin can be very, very extremely powerful for healing moral injury. And so my sense of it is that, like, those two drugs, those two medicines, however you want to think about it, I don't feel bad calling them drugs, because like doctors give people drugs all the time, right? I mean, caffeine's a drug, nicotine's a drug, alcohol's a drug, aspirin, Tylenol, these are all drugs. And so I don't feel bad calling them drugs. Are they medicines? Depending on how you use them, yeah, absolutely. Very powerful medicines. But it's my sense that these two drugs, they do different things and they heal different aspects of PTSD. And so my recommendation to researchers is like, look at ways that they can be complementary to each other. Because I think, like, for example, somebody that's just at the beginning of their healing journey and hasn't done a lot of work, a facilitated session on MDMA could really help open them up and kind of shift them to maybe being more vulnerable with themselves and allow them to kind of really start down the path of healing, right? And facilitate that forward movement. But with psilocybin, it's like a low dose, maybe like a half a gram sitting in the woods with some friends or something like that, or again with a facilitated experience either by a therapist or a trip sitter or someone, can also likewise help a person initiate and start that healing journey. And there are ways for an inexperienced person that maybe hasn't done a lot of work yet to have a positive experience with higher doses of psilocybin. The researchers at Johns Hopkins seem to have developed a very effective protocol to do just that. But I guess I'm trying to warn the potential DIYers out there to be smart about how you're approaching using these drugs. Don't do something stupid out of desperation. And one of the things that I really want to emphasize is that psychedelics are to the healing process what steroids are to bodybuilding, only without the negative side effects for the most part. And what I mean by that is, it's like, can psychedelics by themselves do a lot to heal a person? Yes, but they're not magic. They don't just come in and fix everything. Like, they can, like if you have this much PTSD to heal, right? Maybe one good experience with MDMA or psilocybin will fix that for you and give you what you need. But somebody that has like a lot of trauma like I did, or has like quote unquote treatment resistant PTSD or CPTSD like I did, it's like the psychedelics, like the first experience will be this much benefit, and then the next experience is this much benefit, and it's like diminishing returns, right? And so you get to a point where it's like the drugs themselves aren't going to move you forward. You have to be doing this other work. And that's why I made this video kind of after I made all the other videos because I wanted to explain what psychedelics do in the context of the other work that we're doing. And so it's like, if you think about someone that's trying to be a bodybuilder, right? It's like, if you look at the difference between natural bodybuilders and non-natural bodybuilders, it's like there's a very big difference. And it's the same thing like somebody that's trying to heal with and without psychedelics. But it's like, if the person isn't going to the gym and isn't managing their nutrition properly and isn't doing all of the other things that they would need to normally do to grow muscle, taking steroids is kind of a waste, right? And it's a similar thing with psychedelics. It's like, I know a lot of people that have done as much or more psychedelics than I did, and they didn't see nearly as much benefit in terms of healing as I did from it, because they weren't using it as intentionally as I was, and they weren't putting in all of the effort and work that I was outside of the psychedelic experiences, because there's a lot of preparation that you have to do before you go into the experience. And it's not necessarily specific to that one experience. It's just that you have to practice mindfulness. You have to learn a little bit about psychology, because really what you're doing is you're learning about yourself, right? That's what psychology is. It's the human mind. And so you are a human mind, right? And so learning some psychological concepts about the ego and about the unconscious mind and about your shadow and these different things, I feel are necessary for a person to get the most out of those experiences. And then likewise, just with the healing work that you do leading up to an experience, and especially after the experience, right? It's in the psychedelic community and in psychedelic circles, like integration is a big deal, right? And it's how you integrate those experiences afterwards, what you do with that psychedelic experience after the fact, right? And it's like, you won't remember, say, 95% of your trip, let's say on psilocybin, right? Or even MDMA, but as you do the work, like, you'll remember, oh yeah, I had this experience and it made me realize this. And then you'll like think about that for a few days. And then like a week later, you'll remember another part of the trip, and you'll kind of work on that a little bit. And so it really, like, psychedelics have to be combined with the work. You can't just like take them and everything's going to be fine. It doesn't work like that. You know, it's like, we think of like if you have a headache, you take some Tylenol and that's all you have to do. You just swallow the pills and then you forget about it, and pretty soon your headache's gone, right? That's not really how psychedelics work when it comes to healing trauma. It can be if there's not a lot to heal. And I don't know what the threshold for that is. Like, that's very subjective, right? What is this much trauma versus this much trauma? Who knows? But I just really wanted to emphasize that, because I think some people think of psychedelics as kind of like this magic bullet that, you know, like I said, you have a headache, you take a pill, the headache goes away. Oh, I have trauma, I'm going to take some psilocybin and the trauma is just going to go away. It's like, well, like I said, diminishing returns, right? You'll get this much out of the first experience, second, third, and then pretty soon you're not getting nearly as much out of them if you're not doing the work. And so hopefully this video has made sense. Hopefully you're finding these videos useful and interesting. Like, subscribe, share on social media, help me spread the word. I greatly appreciate it. Thanks for watching.